A Brief for the Defense by Jack Gilbert. Sorrow everywhere, slaughter everywhere. If babies are not starving someplace, they are starving somewhere else, with flies in their nostrils. But we enjoy our lives because that's what God wants. Otherwise, the mornings before summer dawn would not be made so fine. The Bengal tiger would not be fashioned so miraculously well. The poor women at the fountain are laughing together between the suffering they have known and the awfulness in their future, smiling and laughing while somebody in the village is very sick. There is laughter every day in the terrible streets of Calcutta, and the women laugh in the cages of Bombay. If we deny our happiness, resist our satisfaction, we lessen the importance of their deprivation. We must risk delight. We can do without pleasure, but not delight, not enjoyment. We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil. If the locomotive of the Lord runs us down, we should give thanks that the end had magnitude. We must admit that there will be music despite everything. We stand at the prow again of a small ship anchored late at night in the tiny port looking over to the sleeping island. The waterfront is 3 shuttered cafes and 1 naked light burning. To hear the faint sound of oars in the silence as a rowboat comes slowly out and then goes back is truly worth all the years of sorrow that are to come. This is the obituary from the New York Times of the groundbreaking poet. He was a very, very interesting man. He died 1 year ago after a very eventful life at age 87. I found myself not really interested in his birth date or when he died. I was really interested in the small details of his life and how that affected his writing style and the work that he created. His poems are described as frank, forthright, and emotionally fraught, and that they observe the grand universal realities of love and death from a perspective off the literary grid. After I read that line, I thought a lot of different things. Why does that distinguish Gilbert? Why does that really set him apart? Are other poets not honest in their works? Deborah Garrison, the poetry editor at Nof, says, "He has a very different tone from other poets of our time, a very fierce declarative tone." After looking forward, I found that isn't what sets him apart to me. Maybe that's one of the reasons his writing stood out to me, because it really did from the others that we read, but I realized how multidimensional Gilbert's writings are. That's something special. He doesn't simply write about the sadness of life or the happiness. He mixes sorrow and hope in sort of a peculiar way that just works. Garrison also said that there is something very straight on about Jack, and yet he is a helpless romantic who loves the world and its pleasures so much, and our failures and our loneliness. To me, Gilbert was sort of one big contradiction, and I love that so much. I think that in itself is so intriguing, and that really shines through in his poems. He's unconventional, though, and he's unique. He didn't go to a literary school. The only distinct aspects of his writing style are the short and choppy sentences that he uses to state his point, which I'll point out throughout. He uses those sentences to get right to his point. He does that in the very first line of A Brief for the Defense. Other than that, his poems are just very straightforward. He didn't necessarily use any strict format for his poems. Like I said, he's unconventional. He sort of went his own route. He doesn't use any strict format. The way he writes is very fluid. Besides the intentional short and choppy sentences that he uses that specifically state the main points that he's trying to make. Starting with the title, A Brief for the Defense, it certainly exemplifies one of the main themes in all of Gilbert's works. Breaking up the 2 parts of the title, by saying a brief, he sort of prepares us for his simple and direct nature. That's shown throughout his works, that he gets to his points. And in the first line there, sorrow everywhere, slaughter everywhere. Two-word sentences. And then a few lines after, why did he break up with flies in their nostrils? The line directly before that says, if babies are not starving someplace, they are starving somewhere else with flies in their nostrils. But he made that a separate sentence because he really wants to show us the struggle that they face. And I think that's so great, the way that he did that. But back to the second part of the title. For the defense, the second part is something I really struggled with. For the defense of whom? The defense of the voiceless, or the voice of those who experience pleasure? Is he defending those who have? Is he defending himself? The ideas in this poem are certainly his own, so maybe that can double as defending himself while defending those who feel they must deny their happiness. A Brief for the Defense is really a poem about the fine line between pleasure and delight, and it contains conflicting concepts. The main theme of the poem is the idea of acknowledging suffering, pain, and poverty while enjoying yourself and not feeling guilty about it. Not letting that take your happiness away. Even though food is not necessarily mentioned explicitly in this poem, a lot of people struggle with recognizing the pain others face by not having enough food while enjoying food themselves, and that's including me, and that's one of the reasons why I find this poem so interesting. And I think Gilbert really highlights this push and pull we feel sometimes. But he doesn't just acknowledge the struggles of the less fortunate. He really shows it when he talks about the babies with the flies in their nostrils in line 3. And he was able to incorporate the fact that suffering can't be ignored while talking about it being okay to find delight in what we have. And it was incredible the way he put it all together. After that, he says, but we enjoy our lives because that's what God wants. And he separated that part as well. When I first read that, I thought that line was sarcasm before I kept reading, before I saw that his point was that really is what he thinks that we should do. But I thought that was sarcasm at first. But I love how he follows that up by talking about the beautiful scenery and things that people may not appreciate daily. But he says that those things make everything worthwhile. And I love how he weaves that in there. When he talks about the women at the fountain in line 7, he talks about their laughter despite their circumstances. They are poor women, but even while talking about their suffering in that mood, he mentions the fact that they are laughing meanwhile someone else is sick in the village. He sort of highlights the different levels of suffering. But he says that despite that, everyone should be able to experience delight because everyone in some ways experiences a level of distress, even if it's not as bad as someone else's. I love that he uses other examples to show happiness through situations that don't seem like they have a bright side. When he continues to give examples like the laughter in the streets of Calcutta and the cages of Bombay. The next part, though, was something that really hits home when dissected. Here, he uses the short, choppy sentences again when he says, we must risk delight. I'll read it again. If we deny our happiness, resist our satisfaction, we lessen the importance of the deprivation. We must risk delight. We can do without pleasure, but not delight, not enjoyment. We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil. I love how he splits up the part that says not enjoyment, because that's sort of adding on to his last point, but it sort of highlights it in a way that I wouldn't have thought before, because I didn't really know the difference. In that part, there are a lot of different concepts packed in just those 7 lines. I think that, it's saying if you're not happy simply because you're guilty of having things that others don't have, you're doing a disservice to yourself, and it simply doesn't help those who have less. It just lessens the importance of their deprivation, as Gilbert puts it. While reading this poem, though, I wasn't able to distinguish the difference between delight and pleasure because I thought they were synonyms or pretty close to it. So I looked up the definitions of both words, and I found that pleasure is the fulfillment of one's wishes, expectations, or needs, and delight is a strong feeling of happiness. And that really clarified those lines for me. So now I think what Gilbert is saying here is that we can do without our expectations being met, but we can't survive without at least a fraction of happiness. Of course, sometimes happiness comes from our expectations being met, but happiness does not rely on our expectations being met, and neither does our survival. I love how he goes on to say that we must be stubborn in order to really deal with the cruelties of the world in the next line when he talks about the world being a ruthless furnace. He says we have to focus on the positives instead of just making injustice the only measure of our attention. And I think, the last 10 lines are all a metaphor for death. We already know that that is one of the main themes of Gilbert's works, the reality of death. And we also know that he uses metaphors a lot. But he really paints the picture of what a metaphor actually looks like. In the New York Times obituary of his life, it talks about another poem he wrote based on a situation that occurred in his life when his lover, Mashiko, died from cancer. The poem is called Mashiko Dead. And it says, he moves his thumbs slightly when the fingers begin to tire, and it makes different muscles take over. Afterward, he carries it on his shoulder until the blood drains out of the arm that is stretched up to steady the box and the arm goes numb. But now the man can hold underneath again, so that he can go on without ever putting the box down. The New York Times article says that he wrote about grief as an enduring physical burden, that he manages like somebody carrying a box that is too heavy. In that poem, he doesn't just say that grieving is like a box that is too heavy, even though that is what he means in this poem. He really shows the struggle of carrying the box, and I think that's what he does in the last 10 lines of A Brief for the Defense. He says, if the locomotive of the Lord runs us down, we should give thanks that the end had magnitude. We must admit that there will be music despite everything. We stand at the prow again of a small ship anchored late at night in the tiny port looking over to the sleeping island. The waterfront is 3 shuttered cafes and 1 naked light burning. To hear the faint sound of oars in the silence as a rowboat comes slowly out and then goes back is truly worth all the years of sorrow that are to come. I think the locomotive of the Lord running us down is, if death strikes, and is sort of acknowledging death's inevitability. He says that we should give thanks that the end had magnitude, and I think he means, making sure that your life was worth it when you look back. That can only be achieved if you don't waste your life denying your happiness. I believe that's exactly what he means here. He says that we must accept there will be music throughout everything, and my interpretation of that is that no matter what, there are always positives, but we can't ignore them. That relates back to his point about not making injustice the only measure of our attention. So that leaves the last 7 lines, and I'll repeat them. We stand at the prow again of a small ship anchored late at night in the tiny port looking over the sleeping island. The waterfront is 3 shuttered cafes and 1 naked light burning. To hear the faint sound of oars in the silence as a rowboat comes slowly out and then goes back is truly worth all the years of sorrow that are to come. I think the small ship looking over the sleeping island is a metaphor for looking at the inevitability of death at the start of one's life. I think the 3 shuttered cafes are the possibilities at the end of one's life, but the naked burning light is hope. The journey of the rowboat is life itself, And as